Welcome to the Craft to Career podcast with Elizabeth Chappell, where every week we dive into how you can turn your craft into a successful career. Get ready to have the career you've always dreamed of.
Welcome to episode 18 of the Craft to Career podcast. I am Elizabeth Chappell, the host of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this week's guest. We have Meghan Buchanan of Then Came June, and Meghan is hands down one of the most influential, successful modern quilt pattern designers that's out there right now. And I'm just so excited that she was willing to spend the time to share her story of how she got started. And that leads me to this week's review. It's a short and sweet review, and it's from Sarah E123 ! She says, "Love listening. I am not even in the quilting biz right now. So interesting and inspiring hearing everyone's story of how they started." Sarah, thank you. And I love that you're not even in the quilting business and that you enjoy the podcast. So that is extra cool. And with that, let's jump in and let me introduce you to Meghan of Then Came June.
Meghan, I'm super excited to have you here. And first of all, for those who don't know you, you are Meghan of Then Came June. Yeah. And I know, I followed you for a while and I assumed your name was June. And I'm like, no, it's Meghan. So just starting off with, will you share the name of your company and how that came about?
Yeah, so when I was kind of trying to formulate a business name, when I first started quilting and I kind of got into a part where I wanted to just cover my costs, I was like, well, I should have some kind of name associated with it if people are paying me something. And I didn't want it to be just my name, like Meghan Buchanan Designs or something. And I wanted it to be a name that wasn't too literal or didn't have meaning, but not something where, like people who get tattoos and then someone's like, hey, what's that tattoo mean? And they're like, I'm not telling you.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Well, for me, I'm like, I want to feel confident in saying what the meaning is behind it, and not have it be attached solely to my name in case, the avenues changed or what I did changed or whatever. So Then Came June came about because I got into quilting because I suffered from postpartum depression when I had my son, who just turned 7 last month. And I was just in a season of life where nothing I was doing felt satisfying. I thought motherhood was going to be this amazing purpose-filling experience, and it was just not for me. And my friend suggested hey, you need to do something for yourself. You've always been creative. She had made a quilt from a tutorial online, and she was like, why don't you just go to Joann's, go buy fabric. You have a sewing machine. I had $100 Singer or whatever from Target, just a really great entry level straight stitch machine. And so that's how I found quilting. Is I made my first quilt, fell in love with it. And so when I was kind of coming up with the meaning behind it, it's my son was born in June. And so everything in my world, good and bad, changed in the month of June. So that's kind of how I came with Then Came June.
So that's okay. This is a super interesting topic. And for the men in the audience, I do have a few men, but however, most are women. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's a topic we don't talk about a whole ton, that motherhood, and not everyone's a mom. However, I did get this sense that when you're a mother, it's just so fulfilling and you're going to love it. And for me, I also started my business when my kids were young and I felt this guilt about why do I not feel like this is enough for me? I still have this bug that I want to do something for me. And now that I'm through it, I feel like it's really important for moms to have something that's their own.
Yeah. Yeah. And regardless if you turn it into a career or not, it was just in that season of life, I had come off of my husband and I got married young, 21, 22, kind of dove into being adults and having to get jobs just to pay the bills. It was at the height of the recession. And so the first few years of marriage were just hard, and it was a big struggle financially. And we had just come off of this, tried this experience of working for the small family business, moved ourselves to a different state. It was not at all what we were expecting it to be. I hated life, really bad. and came back, and I had left a job that I kind of struggled with throughout it, like in this professional environment. It was a pretty conservative, like accounting style firm where I am very bubbly and personable and joke, and I just couldn't grasp the nature of the job. And so I was like always getting bad reviews at work. And I felt like, when I left on good terms because I really had like learned, I had found a voice in the job. And so they had told me when I left that job, they're like, hey, if you guys ever come back to Portland, doesn't work out, let us know, we'd hire you back. Well, 9 months later, when we came back, they didn't hire me back. They said they didn't want me. They didn't think it'd be a good fit. And so before I got pregnant, I was just like, immediately felt like I'm a failure. I'm not a hard worker. People don't want me. What do I even have to give? And so I almost viewed motherhood as like, well, is this what I meant to do? Is this why? Like, is this the thing that I'm not good for working in a corporate environment, or I don't have anything to give because I'm not professional. And so then when I got pregnant and had my son, I hoped and prayed that I would have this euphoric experience of like, this is what I'm called to do. And for those first few months, it was okay. Like I still was pumped full of hormones, from just having had a baby. But it was around month 4 where it's like, you're still never sleeping, constantly attached to this little human. And your days just don't even feel like days. It's just like one never ending diaper, feed, clean, diaper, feed, clean. Like at the end of the day, my husband could come home from work and the house could look exactly the same as it did that morning. Yet I did stuff all day. You just had nothing to prove. And so that just felt like I had to do something for myself because I felt like I was also failing at motherhood. And so I was just at my lowest low of all confidence as well, which I think played into desperately needing something to be like, I'm at least good at something. And none of my friends suffered from postpartum depression. So I felt even more isolated because they would notice that how I'm feeling was not their experience, and not that it was bad, but they're like, I think you are really struggling. And I'm like, yeah, whatever, But I got into counseling and was diagnosed with postpartum, and just being validated just felt so, I'm like, okay, I'm not in my head. Like this experience is very difficult for me. It's not always like this for other moms. And so that just really helped me kind of recognize like I wasn't alone. And then being able to find quilting was like a godsend. It was just the only thing at the time that brought me back to what I liked doing, which was being creative. I went to college for merchandising with my emphasis in interior. So I took color theory classes. I took textile classes where you would burn all different kind of fibers and figure out how they burn differently. I took architecture classes, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of randomly fell into a world that made sense to me that I never, like no one I knew quilted growing up.
So, okay, that's so interesting. Like you knew that you had this desire for creativity, art, color, fabrics, but quilting was an unknown. And what was that first job that you had? What did you say it was, like a bank or something?
Yeah. So the first job, so this is another kind of wild experience. So I got a 4-year degree. My husband did not, because what he wanted to do from like the get-go was work in the live event industry in lighting, sound, projection, which you don't need a degree for, you need experience for. And so I'm like, okay, well, I obviously have a degree. I'll get the job that has the healthcare. And then when we move up to Portland, we're in the city, you're going to easily find so many different jobs. And so I had lined up a more corporate style job with Wells Fargo, right at like, we, rented an apartment. I had my offer letter for like the deposit, blah, blah, blah. A week before our honeymoon, I got called saying that entire division was closing. And so on the honeymoon, I was interviewing within Wells Fargo because luckily at the time they absorbed as many people as they could. So instead of having like a more corporate, like I just became a bank teller. So my first job outside of college was just being an hourly teller at the bank, but it did provide healthcare for our family. And I lasted at that job for I want to say 10 months and then up and quit one day. I just like couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah. Well, especially for us creatives, like
Yeah.
a little bit soul crushing, you know,
Mhm.
job like that.
And I mean, it kind of is foreshadowing like the corporate culture of what I did not like. I'd have to be like, welcome to Wells Fargo today, Elizabeth. How can I help you? Oh, have you looked at opening a credit card? Like all these things where you have to say these things and you like open an account, not saying this is you, but I'm like, you're negative $500. Like, why would I offer you a credit card? You know, but it's like, I would get in trouble by not doing these things.
Yeah.
It was kind of foreshadowing. I'm like, I don't know why I continued in this corporate venture, but it was the only thing that made sense at the time because a lot of the creative jobs I was interested in just weren't hiring. Like my ideal job when I graduated was I wanted to be a visual merchandiser, like working on magazine shoots and catalog shoots, stuff like that. And I kind of found my way a little bit back to that, not in that avenue, but later.
Yeah.
Before I had my son, I was able to work at Crate and Barrel for a while. And that's kind of what got my foot back into the door to the idea of textiles and working in them and enjoying the design aspect of like creating a space. So
Yeah. So how did Then Came June morph from you making your first quilt to like selling your first pattern? How did that journey happen?
yeah. Okay. So when did I have my kid? 2014. Okay. So I started my first quilt project in December of 2014. And I think I finished it in like March of 2015 or something. And then at that point, I was just in that wave of where all my friends were also having babies or their first baby. And so because I had made one and like, you know, making something personable or personalized to a baby was a huge deal, especially for people's first. And so I was like, I'll make you a baby quilt, you know? And so it kind of started with me first making all these baby quilts for friends and sort of customizing to like, okay, do you want it to be like super gender specific? Like if you're a boy, what do you want it to look like and colors? And then I just used a lot of like super basic patchwork style quilts. I used quite a few of Cluck Cluck Sew's patterns. I think I used a few of Susie Quilt's patterns at the beginning and started doing that. And then it kind of got to the point where I had so many orders and I was by no means paying myself. All I was paying for was my costs, which felt great at the time because we had no disposable income. I wasn't working. But then I realized like I am stressed. I have a toddler now on my hands. And I think at one point I had like 8 custom baby quilts needing to be made in like 3 weeks. And I was still quilting it all myself. And there was this one project that I'm like forever grateful I got to do, but it was the heaviest project I have ever worked on. And it's memory quilts for, I lived in Texas for a small amount of time between 4th and 8th grade. And a girl I knew back then, her older sister lost her husband who was like 32 or something suddenly. And they had 2 little girls who were like 18 months and a couple months old. And she shipped me like all of his clothes and I cut all his clothes apart and I made his little baby girl's quilts. I made his mother a quilt and I ended up making her one since I had so much fabric. And like, I was just crying. I cried every single time I was working on this quilt, like having my kid and then imagining my husband dying or imagining someone having to make me a quilt if my son died when I was older. And it just kind of like, my husband was like, you need to take a break because I would get super overwhelmed and really crabby and mad and I would just cry. And he's like, this is like not healthy. And again, I am still so grateful. And I have photos of the little girls on the quilts and like, you know, the project is so meaningful. But at that point where I was with how much I had taken on and then to take on a quilt that I could not separate myself from was just like the nail in the coffin for custom quilts. I was like, okay, so how do I keep quilting and be in this industry and make money? By no means was I like, I want to make a career. I just wanted to make a little bit more money that was not as involved with also dealing with others' aesthetics. Like I really wanted to do what I wanted to do. And so after talking to just like a few people and kind of looking at it, and like, you know, I had come up with a few of my own quilts, just like simple star quilts, you know, but like I put my own spin on it. I realized like the only way at that time, or even now, I would say, for as long as I've been in this industry, quilt patterns are you're going to get the most passive income ever from designing and selling quilt patterns. And so that's kind of how just my motivation was like, oh my gosh, this is giving me so much personally. I have something to do for myself. I don't want to give it up, but how do I do it where I'm now taking more control over what I'm making, how I'm making it? And so that's kind of how the idea went from custom to then designing and selling my first pattern. And then at that point it was like, okay, I could do all the chicken scratch, and I could, on graph paper, I would kind of graph out what I was making, but I didn't know how to put it on the computer. I didn't know how to digitally do it. Like in college, I took a couple AutoCAD classes and a little bit of Illustrator, but I mean, this is now 6 years later and haven't been in any of those programs. And so at this point I had been testing quilts for Emily Dennis of Quilty Love. And her and I we kind of hit it off, and, you know, exchanged phone numbers like years ago, texting, just kind of sharing about life. She had already had a few kids, so she had a lot of insight on my crazy toddler phase. And, she was like, do you want me to FaceTime you? And I'll just show you some of the basics in Illustrator, since you already have Illustrator. Like, here's how you make a shape. Here's how you group things together. Here's how you fill in color. Here's how you know how to transform a size, like if you want it to be 4 inches or 5 inches. And so she just straight up got on FaceTime with me and helped me figure out the basics. And that's kind of how it started, was her being willing to give me like just the most basic information. And then I kind of just went to town.
So first of all, Emily is so sweet, and I absolutely love her.
Yes.
And I mean, from the little bit that I know her, I sound like we're best friends for life, but I think everyone loves her. So that's just so sweet. And it speaks volumes. I love that she was not threatened by sharing that information with someone, and that she's like, let me just help you. And I love that. I love that attitude. So then my question is, do you only use Illustrator? Do you use EQ8? Like, how do you design your patterns?
Yeah. So when I first started, back when you could actually buy a license to have the Adobe Suite, so the Illustrator I'm working on is from 2012. I am in
Not paying that monthly
I am
thing.
not paying anything for it, but it's to the point where like, if somebody else sends me a file, or like I'm working with a company, I'm like, you got to dumb it down as low as you possibly can, because if I open it in mine, it's gibberish.
Yep.
So we're kind of getting to the point where I'm thinking I might actually pay and upgrade, but I'm anti-learning new things, specifically with a computer. But what's really funny about this Illustrator, if anyone has worked in Illustrator, you're all going to freaking cringe. I did not realize you could have artboards. So I would export every single page as its own file. And then I would go into PDF, like Adobe Reader, and I would insert page and merge them. So my first 8 patterns are still like that. I've never reconverted them. So I'm like, dear God, I don't want to lose these files, because I mean, thankfully I have the printed pattern. I have so many emails that I would just be regurgitating all of it, but it would take forever. But yes, so I still only work in Illustrator. I work in Photoshop a little bit when I'm trying to knock out backgrounds for like cover photos, but I don't think I have. The one thing that wasn't part of our license that we bought was InDesign, which I know would be a big help. But yeah, so all of my text, everything is built in Illustrator. I do know how to use artboards now. Yeah. And I've never used EQ8. So after I'd written my first couple patterns and did it my very non-correct way, I looked at buying EQ8, but for some reason, it's like I still knew Illustrator. I didn't need something to kind of like, you know, like I'm not super knowledgeable about EQ8, but I feel like you can kind of come up with an idea and then you're like, turn it 90 degrees and everything shifts. So for
Mhm.
me, I'm just like, usually when I'm messing around, I have a very specific idea in my head, and I feel like it would actually overwhelm me to have so many options in EQ8.
Yep.
So I'm really controlling. So I kind of feel like I like having the control as much as it kills me at times to have to like literally do everything, but it's also all I've done now. So it's kind of my
Yeah. And I mean, like I started off with only EQ8 and now the more that I use Illustrator, I'm almost only Illustrator. So, but it's an
yeah,
interesting, I like to hear different designers and like, so what do you use and what do
right.
you do? Well, what was your first pattern that you released? And what was your first pattern, and maybe the same one, when you realized, whoa, this is bigger than I thought. Like this can be a career, you know?
Okay, so kind of funny story. First pattern I ever designed was Fairy Crossing, which ended up actually being the second one I released.
Mm-hmm.
Because I made that one, I was excited about it, but then I had for fun made an inside out star quilt and had been posting about it, and I got so much positive feedback at the time, and I was like, oh shoot, maybe this should be my first one since it's like pretty easy. I can write it pretty quickly. It's one size. I give a couple different options. I actually give flannel. So I guess in a way it's not the most simple first pattern, but it goes to show like I rarely design a pattern that does not have multiple like options and sizes, and because I want to give you every single idea that I've popped into my head.
Mm-hmm.
So technically Inside Out Star was my first release, but Fairy Crossing, which was my second release, was designed first. I just kind of kicked it back like a month.
Okay.
But for the first one that really felt like probably was Sienna Burst, which was my 7th pattern, and or my Sidewalk Chalk City Grid release, which was back when I was still doing double pattern releases, which I stopped doing a few years ago now. And
What's a pattern release? Like,
like
could you have?
re-released 2 patterns on the same day. That
Oh,
was
I did not.
very much a thing when I first started, was like double release. So instead of, for easy numbers, if it's $10, so instead of $10, you can get both patterns for 16 or, whatever. And it was like, you'd have double the content, but I still hate doing that. So I don't do it anymore. It's way too much work. And my marketing is evolved and it's way more involved now.
Mm-hmm.
And I make more than one sample. So this would be back when I was making only one sample of a quilt to promote it. But Sienna Burst was what felt like my first truly super original star design and more difficult pattern. It was my first not my first, actually my second intermediate quilt pattern because it has half rectangle triangles in it. And it's the one that I actually reached out to back when they were cotton and steel. I reached out to Melody Miller in email saying, hey, this is my design. Sienna was the Alexia Marcella bag line that was going to be coming out. And it has like a very beautiful Southwestern tones. And I'm from Arizona. And so I just felt really connected to the line. And then everything about Sienna Burst was kind of like starbursts and sunbursts from the desert. And so I reached out and asking for fabric. That was the first time I'd ever asked for fabric for quote unquote free,
Mm-hmm.
and they agreed as long as it was the cover quilt. And so like that was the first time I feel like I partnered with a company in a strategic way. And at that time, their reach really went far for me. And I think it was a pretty good release. Honestly, it's now like 4 years ago. So I feel like I'm blacking it out. But that was definitely kind of the start of like, okay, maybe they're actually giving me something for free. So maybe my name actually does mean a little something. And the fact they liked my design. But then, so that was summer. And so that next winter is when I released Sidewalk Chalk and City Grid, which was the first time I had patterns in a lookbook for Robert Kaufman, using obviously Kona cotton.
Mm-hmm.
And that one really like exploded my release numbers, where I was at, and I think started to legitimize me in the industry beyond just like a modern quilter who people found me on Instagram or randomly found me on the internet. you know, because shops could see it. And then like being in a lookbook on Robert Kaufman's site is consumers could see it. And so that one definitely legitimized me. But then the one that obviously blew up, I'm guessing you might know which one that was Meadowland.
Yeah, why? Like, what? Do you have any idea why? Like,
Yeah.
and before that, Robert Kaufman, did you reach out to them or did they reach out to you to be in the lookbook?
Honestly, I don't remember.
Okay, that's like, it's me sitting here. I'm like, I've never done that. I should reach out to them. But
I kind of, honestly, I think maybe I did reach out to them being like, hey, I did it with Cotton and Steel. I wonder if I do this with Robert Kaufman, they'd send me the fabric. Then at that point, that's when I started my relationship with Elise, who works with Robert Kaufman. And she's the one now that I contact all the time. And I work with my bundles with her and my different projects. But that would have been 2018. So
okay.
that was like 3.5 years ago. So I kind of just forget. But I know that it had to have been like, I don't remember feeling like sought out. But
Okay.
yeah.
It happened.
Yeah.
And oh, right. As I'm saying this, like, oh, I should do that. Tell me, do you ever do that where you see someone else do something that worked well for them and you instantly go to, oh, I should be doing that too, even though logically you're like, that might not be the best route for me. But do you instantly do that?
I do it in the sense of like, I don't instantly think, hey, I should do that. I think, could I do that? And I think more than anything, I don't instantly say like, that's for me or I should do that. But I'm like, damn it, why didn't I think of that? And I'm very competitive. It's like one of my negative qualities. And so I get more like mad that I haven't thought of that. And then I start to think like, well, should I do that? But so much of how my business has been built has been not around what I want to do and how I want to do it, but what I can do with where I'm at in my life and with, you know, having a kid and not being working full time or having childcare or whatever. So most of the time, you know, I'm like, oh, I wish I didn't have, like, I wish my kid was in school full time. I wish he was 16 and not asking me for snacks every 2 minutes, you know, which maybe they still do when they're 16, but
they do.
Yeah. Eat you out of house and home, but
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so I have a therapist and we meet regularly and I'll chat about it's been really liberating to have her tell me like, do you want to do this? And she's like, do I? I don't know. Let me think about that, you know? And I found in my business when I try to do the things that other people are doing, it doesn't go well. And then when I step back and like, what do I really want to do? It goes well, you know? So I don't know. Any truth to that?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think for me, I get ideas in my head and I am the person who I get an idea and I don't stop until I've done it. And like everything, like I narrowly focus and I delete everything else out of my life, which is, I think, part of my success, but also is part of why I get burnt out or I do things without fully thinking through the big picture and then realizing, well, shit, I failed at this because I didn't think it through. But it was like, I started therapy a few months ago and my therapist in one of our sessions was like, okay, well, if you at that point in my life, like, what would your day look like? Like, if you're saying you're trying to do all these things, tell me what your day would look like. And so I kind of spieled off and she just goes, so everything you just said, does that sound sustainable? And I was like, not at all. She was like, exactly. You need to do less. And she was like, you need to be more gracious with yourself. You need to like really think, what do I need to do for me? And so I feel like that there's so much truth to like, is this really what I want? Or is this what I assume I'm supposed to do? Or is this like you see someone else did it, so it's got to work? But I love the quote. I think it's Glennon Doyle, I want to say, who was like, why are you asking people for advice who've never walked in your shoes? Like, you have your own path. I butchered that, but essentially, like, why are you asking for advice to go places people have never been? And
I love that. Yeah.
Okay. I need to constantly remind myself of these things.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I'm laughing inside. I'd be so curious to hear of other entrepreneurs, but like, the phrase, aim and fire. What is it? Ready, aim, fire. I'm like, ready, fire, aim.
Yeah.
I jump and go, and then I'm like, did that work out? Oh, I don't know,
Yeah.
So, and again, I attribute that to my success, but a lot of my life, that's been like a downfall where it's like, oh my gosh. So, but you sound like it's the same way for you.
Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of, a string that probably goes all the way through a lot of creative people is that's you find fire. When you find fire, you freaking play in it. Mm-hmm. And then you realize like, oh, I'm too close to the fire. I should probably be a little smarter and step back for a second. Mm-hmm. But I think that's what makes us all unique and have, all of our great moments, but very much we could probably all be a little smarter and more intentional.
Yes. Okay. And then I had jumped ahead to a question that I want to go back to. Okay. Meadowland.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. What? Like, was it the timing? Is it because of the 3 colors? Like, what? Tell me. And who knows? Who knows?
Right. I mean, it is by far the most bonker pattern I have. Like, it is its own beast. I can't control it. I don't know why it's so addicting. I mean, I kind of understand.
Tell me.
It's like, I've rarely met anybody who's made one Meadowland.
So they make multiples,
like constantly making them. I mean, I think I've made 12 or something, like some crazy number. Dang. So I think there was like a few things in play at the time. Meadowland was the first time, well, I had just made flying geese for the first time. So I was like pumped about flying geese because they always terrified me. And I was like, oh, these are really fun and cool. And it was my first like really simplistic block pattern. The other one I had done before Meadowland, unless I'm forgetting one, was Sienna Burst, like very like classic traditional quilt block. And that one was not easy and very time intensive. And I was like, screw that. I want fun, easy. You see a lot of one print. So I think it's the fact that you can show off large scale prints. There is no sashing in this pattern. Some people are very anti-sashing. They are larger cuts of fabric, regardless of, like being able to show off a large scale print. Like the block is a 16-inch block, so it's a larger block. It's mix and match. It is pre-cut friendly. It is scrap friendly. It is yardage friendly. I give like 6 sizes. And I really think like I was just really freaking into it. And I marketed it like crazy. I think people really kind of started to understand a little bit of the chaos I bring to my work in the sense of like, I don't know if you remember this, but for this release, my husband and son had gone camping the week before. It was like part of the release, not the actual release weekend, but they had gone camping the week before and found all these like beautiful wildflowers in the Columbia Gorge, like at hour 15, 20 outside of Portland. And we came home, and at that point, my son was like 3 or 4, and he was like, Dad, Mom would love this spot. Mom would love this spot. And so when he got home that Sunday night, he was like, Megan, this is gorgeous. They're in bloom. And I was like, I just finished my Meadowland. I was like, should we go for sunrise tomorrow? And he's like, Megan, I work tomorrow. And I was like, yeah, but sunrise is at like 5:30. He was like, what are you talking about? And so I woke up my husband and my kid at 4 a.m. the next morning. We drove out, got coffee, took the most epic, beautiful photos of my first finished Meadowland in just like these cliffs where you see the river and like just beautiful flowers, and got coffee on the way back, got home at like 7 o'clock. My husband went to work that day. Like, just everything about it was just the kind of this crazy, chaotic, beautiful experience. And I think people were instantly like, she's nuts, but I kind of like what she's doing. And I had a lot of great testers, and I think people just really enjoyed making it. And you really can't go wrong. Like any aesthetic has been made in this pattern. Like aesthetics I do not like have been made in this pattern. I'm like, oh my gosh, that actually looks okay. And so I do think it is, partly my joy for it, people's love for it themselves. And then it just kind of came a complete beast on their own. People could teach classes. It had traditional enough technique with flying geese, but in a more modern way with larger scale, not as like, nitty gritty with tiny piecing and all traditional piecing, that I think it was able to bridge the modern and traditional world, which is I think where it also blew up like crazy.
Yeah. So that surprised you. The success of that surprised you?
Yeah. And the fact that I released it in May of 2018, and I didn't even do my first quilt along for it until an entire year later. And it just kept going. Like Meadowland was my top selling pattern in 2018, 2019, and 2020.
You're kidding. So far, has it been this year too?
No, it actually is fading this year, which I'm kind of like, yes, not because I hate Meadowland, but I'm like, there's more there, y'all.
Well, I'll be honest. I bought it at QuiltCon, last year before everything shut down, simply out of curiosity. I was like, what? I'm intrigued. Yeah, let me buy that. And when I bought it, they're like, oh yeah, metal. Everyone buys this. I'm like, I'm buying it.
Everyone's bought it. I got to see what the heck this is about.
The madness of crowds.
I know.
So, okay, one of the things that I admire most about you is how open you are. And you share like the ups and downs, your mental health. I mean, even the name of Then Came June ties to the birth of your son and all these changes in your life. So can you share, and if you know, like the highest high that you've had with your business and one of the lowest lows, which might sound depressing, but for entrepreneurs, it's nice to kind of hear, okay, I'm not alone in this,
Totally. So I've asked my husband and Allison, who has been my assistant for a while, what my highest high was. And Allison's like, duh, hiring me. And I laughed and I was like, And then I told my husband that and he's like, well, kinda. And then I thought about it more and I was like, honestly, no, I think that is my highest high I've had was I got my business to a point where I, first of all, one, recognized I needed help. Two, was able to actually know I can pay someone. Like I'm making enough money to pay someone for help. And three, that I just freaking lucked out so much finding Allison. Like truly a fluke. Never met her before. And I joined the Portland Modern Quilt Guild a few years ago. And I put out, I want to say like in the fall, this request on Instagram for local people. I was like, hey, I'm working on a D-stash. I need someone to help me. Like, can anyone interested to come and like collect and curate fabric with me and then ship it out for me? Like I have so many other projects, but I'm exploding. And she responded on Instagram. She was like, I'll do it. And I was like, never met you, but can you come over tomorrow night? And just like truly instantly clicked. And she was so helpful. She's incredibly organized. She gets so giddy off of organization. And she used to be a kindergarten teacher. So I think she like very much, she's like colored labels and all this. Like she gets so pumped about it, which is such a blessing. And so she was just like so on top of it. I let her log into my PayPal. I was like, you invoice all the people. Helped me ship it all out, got it organized. And I thanked her, and I paid her because essentially I was like, I'll give you a chunk of whatever we sell. And so that was in the fall. And then, at that point, I wasn't thinking about an assistant or any of that kind of stuff. But then also that fall and winter, I had filmed my first class with what was Craftsy and then Blueprint and now back to Craftsy. Mm-hmm. And so I had all these projects that were no longer under my deadlines, which was incredibly stressful for me. And so that spring I was talking to my husband and I was like, I really need help. Like I don't need full-time. I can't provide full-time, but I just need someone to help me sew my samples, someone who can help me cut and iron fabric, who could fulfill distributor orders. And he was like, well, why don't you reach out to Allison? Like you guys worked really well in the fall. And I was like, I don't know. Like she's got 2 kids and she runs a charity. And he was like, well, you never know until you ask. So I texted her out of the blue and I was like, hey, you want to go to breakfast tomorrow? And she was like, yep. And so we went to breakfast and I was like, so do you want to work for me? And she was like, yep. And that was it. Nice. Like such an easy transition. And, it's pretty part-time. Like I think in the heyday, like really busy weeks, it'd maybe be like 15 hours a week. But most of the time it'd be like 8 to 10, like 2, 4-hour mornings. But it like doubled my productivity because I was only working when my son was in school. And so to be able to tag team where she would just bring her machine and we'd sit at my kitchen table, could both bust out a bunch of blocks. Or if I need to do a lot of computer work, like I can give her the sewing work. And it just really made me a lot more efficient in how I work. And then, with COVID, it's just been really in and out, but she's still with me. And I now have a second very part-time assistant who helps me with like other computer things. And I'm excited to have Allison come back and help me with all that stuff behind me, my fabric cabinet and sewing. And luckily during COVID, she, was able to still do a ton from her house. Like I would drop off sample work and she would help me sew just from her house.
Yeah, I heard someone, and I'm curious, and maybe this gets into like weird talking about number territory, but I heard a guy who works with a bunch of different companies say, generally people, like when you first start out, and people who are listening to this podcast who are new time entrepreneurs, it gets really intimidating at first to be like, hire an assistant. I can't afford that. Like I'm doing this, I'm trying to earn money. Like I don't have that luxury. But there does get to a point to where you're earning enough, hopefully, and you're busy enough that you're capped out unless you hire someone.
Absolutely.
And so this guy that I heard who works with a bunch of different entrepreneurs, he was like, usually that caps around $40,000 per year for income. Break into the next category to get into over $40,000 a year is hiring on somebody. And so I don't know, I haven't seen all the studies. He's worked with enough people, but I'm like, that's interesting. So the goal, I guess, for a beginning entrepreneur, when you get to that $40,000 point where that's how much you're earning per year, then that might be a time to think about, I don't know, hiring.
Yeah, for me, it was never like, hey, I've hit this threshold, so now I feel like I can afford it. It was more because everything I made for those first, honestly, till this year, everything I've been making has had a very specific purpose for our family. It has, first of all, it was just covering the cost of my hobby. And then it was helping us pay down all of our commercial debt we had. Then it was, saving for a true emergency savings. Like if I lost my job, Luke lost his job, then it was saving to buy the house we're currently in. And so it is for sure profit, but it wasn't just so I could be like, well, now I'm going to go spend all this money on dresses and clothes. And like, yes, our lifestyle has increased with the fact that we now make, double income. But I will say that I think I just realized at that point, like Allison needed it just as much as I did. She needed that thing to get her out of the house, to remind her she is more than a mother and a wife and running a charity and doing all the fun things and PTA. Like she's like, I like sewing. I like chatting with my friend for hours a day. And so I think it was just the perfect combination of her needing it for reasons beyond just the money too. And for the numbers, the only reason I say that is because at that point I probably was making, I think in 2018, I brought in $90,000 of income. And so it wasn't even until after that I hired her to help me.
Interesting.
So
it was more than that. So you were definitely at that point where, and I don't know for you, for me, it's scary. Anytime I invest in something, whether it's hiring someone, a course, whatever it might be, I always have this fear of like, well, but I should save that money. I'm better off if I save it. And it's almost like this leap of faith, like, okay, just trust that if I hire someone, I can make up that revenue elsewhere.
Right. I think now that you've said that, I think the reason I felt I couldn't or didn't equate it to being able to hire was because we wanted so bad to be out of debt, and we had significant debt. So in my mind, it was like, if I'm hiring someone to help me, that means we're not paying down debt. So mine was like a very linear, what I'm making is getting us out of a hole, And so I think the fact that the first photo shoot Allison came to with me, I announced we were out of debt. And
I remember
that's probably where the freedom came from, is like, well, yes, like now what I'm saving for is for funsies or this or that. And so I like, now that you say that, it's like a light bulb. Like the reason I don't think I ever even considered it is because every cent I made that wasn't expenses or cost went to paying down debt.
So I'm curious, like for someone who's in that scenario, if you, looking back, hindsight's 2020,
right?
If you had hired someone sooner, do you think you would have earned more sooner?
You know, maybe when you do the hindsight 2020 of that, but also I don't feel like I really knew my aesthetic until I had Allison, until I had the freedom to give away the businessy things. Like, you know, when I would get it, when it used to be like, okay, I'm typing, working, I'm sewing. Oh my gosh, I just got a distribute order. So I stop exactly what, like I stop the creative process to now take care of this. Or I get a customer email and someone's mad because they can't download the pattern. I stop what I'm doing and I do customer service, where I was able to have the freedom with Allison to say like, that's not for me. That's why I have Allison. So I can put that on the back burner and I can still focus on the creative. So I think the fact that I hired Allison, you know, freed up so much creative motivation in me that I was able to focus more and more like, what do I like? What feels good? What does Then Came June stand for? What does my aesthetic feel like, you know? And so I just think I was so narrowly focused on getting out of the debt and, you know, and the number 90 is gross. That is not saying that's profit. Like that's before any of my expenses or any of that. But I mean, I could have quote unquote afforded to hire her. It just would have slowed down our being able to pay off debt.
Yep. Okay. And I'm really curious about your aesthetic. It's like this double-edged sword. So I feel like for someone to be successful as a quilt pattern designer, they need to have a unique look, you know, whatever it might be. And unique, I just mean like that they have a look.
Right.
But I also feel like it takes time to get there, you know, like you have to dabble and try and have a few flops. Have you had patterns that have flopped, by the way? I'm so intrigued.
For sure. Yes.
Okay, that makes it feel better.
Yes. No, totally. And it's funny because when I look back at the majority of the ones that haven't done well, you know, I'm always like, why? Or what happened? Like, is it out of my control? Is it actually the pattern is not good enough, quote unquote? And typically it's like 50-50. It's probably environmentally, whatever is happening in the world, timing for the year, stuff like that. Or it was like, I obviously just tried to push that one out too quickly. Like I did not give it the normal presence of mind that I would. Not to say I'm always like, it's all my fault, but obviously it's also my fault. You know, that it's my business. It's what I'm doing. But I do think aesthetic takes a while for sure to find your voice. And specifically when you start quilting, unless you already are a super confident, creative person, you're going to be mimicking others. You're going to mimic what you see. That's how you learn. And so I think it took me a while to stop working according to how others work and to really do what I wanted to do and then hope it stuck, you know? And I think that just takes time to get to. And then, you know, of course, like for me too, it's a giant weight was lifted by paying off debt for our family and this giant burden. So I felt like, okay, now what could I do? Like if I don't have to make this money, if this money's truly extra now,
Yeah.
I give myself more freedom, you know?
Okay. So Megan, this has been awesome. I absolutely love what we've talked about. And I actually legitimately would love to chat for like another hour with you. So we'll have to see this part two if you're up for that ever. But I did want to end with some rapid fire questions. Are you ready? Rapid fire, I usually give feedback. I'm going to try to just be honest rapid fire here.
Okay.
All right. What is your favorite pattern that you've designed?
Campfire Glow.
Okay. Campfire Glow. What is a book everyone should read?
I loved Untamed by Glennon Doyle.
Love it. Yep. Okay. Speaking of books, do you think you'll ever write one, like a quilt book?
I have been asked multiple times and it has never made sense for me or my business. So no.
Okay. But if you do, we won't hold you to that. Just for the record. favorite beverage. What are you drinking now?
I'm drinking, it's like a mocktail. It's sparkling Spindrift with ginger beer and lime.
Ooh, Spindrift, by the way, big fan.
Yeah. Oh, have you had their limeade color?
No.
Lemon limeade. So it's a mix of lemon and lime. It's so good.
Okay. And ginger beer too. Okay. Are you a morning person or night owl?
Morning. I hate night.
And best attribute about yourself?
I am authentic.
Yes, you are. And I like that about you. And for people who are looking for you, where can our listeners find you?
On Instagram, it's Then Came June. My website is thencamejune.com. My Facebook is the same. My Pinterest is Meghan R. Buchanan. It's my actual name.
Okay, very cool. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Meghan, thank you so much for being a guest on the Craft a Career podcast. If you enjoyed this week's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. And next week, I'm really excited to share that our guest will be Sarah Ruiz. She is a NASA engineer by day and a quilterpreneur by night. And I wanted to invite someone on the show who has a full-time career as something else and then has this creative business on the side. And just to get that perspective of how they juggle it, what's that like for them? Because I know a lot of you out there have this creative passion, but you also have a full-time job. And Sarah is completely awesome. You'll learn next week how our paths have crossed and what she helps me with, in fact. And if you are enjoying the podcast, you can share it with a friend by either sending a link to them, or you can take a screenshot and share what you're listening to, whether it's this week's episode with Then Came June or one of the past episodes. It's fun for me to see when people share about the podcast on social media. I like to reshare it when I see that, so feel free to tag me in it. And I'm just really glad to know that this podcast is resonating with the listeners. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.